Hello everyone. First things first, yes it is a soldier demo. My soldier's really bad. Please don't make fun of me. But today we are talking about the banners. So I don't run the banners in this half, and banners are a pretty niche item to use, but they're very powerful, and I figured I'd kind of talk about banners and how you would use them in a competitive setting. So, where to begin? I mean, for starters, let's just talk about, the three different banners, how they differ, what their positives and downsides are. Spoiler, the downside for them are all the same. So, for starters, let's begin with, I suppose, the least commonly used one, which is the buff banner. Now, of course, all the banners take different amounts of damage to charge, and yes, you can technically charge one and then switch at a locker to a different one, and it'll still be full charged. But nonetheless, buff banner does take a while to charge, and there's no passive benefit unlike the other two. But the charge is mini crits, and mini crits is really, or are really powerful for a couple of reasons. So for starters, I think it's, what would it be? A 50% damage bonus, base damage bonus? I'm trying to think, because a mini crit rocket is going to do 135. Yeah, it should be 50 extra damage, because rockets are base 90 damage. But the noteworthy thing is no damage fall off. So your ranged capabilities become way, way more lethal, which is a big deal. So yeah, mini crits are really powerful, of course, but the one trade-off as well about being able to do more range damage is generally much easier to avoid at range. One interesting quirk with the buff banner is that it works quite well with the direct hit, because a mini crit direct hit rocket will one-shot a medic. So yeah, the range capability of the direct hit, it's also easier to hit direct hit rockets at range because they just move faster. But by and large, the buff banner is probably the least common of the three. Next, we're going to talk about the second most used, which is the Conqueror. The Conch is pretty decent. It has a at least useful passive of some health regen, which of course scales up as you get crit heals. I don't know how it relates to crit heals necessarily, if it's an indicator of if you're getting crit heals or not. But some passive health regen can be nice. Now, of course, as we'll discuss in a moment, no amount of health regen is going to really make up for the fact that you are just taking way more damage from rocket jumping. But it's at least something. It's better than it not being there. Now, the activated effect for the Conch is quite nice. A lot of speed comes with it. You have a big speed boost, and your damage heals you. And I'm trying to, let me actually just look. What percent of your damage gets healed? Where is it? It does not say. I think it might be maybe even upwards of 40%. It's a lot. Which, of course, healing is a big deal. On top of the fact that your speed boost means that you can do some crazy just single rocket jumps. With this speed, just doing one C-tap off the ground, you are already going quite far. So Conch, the actual boost itself is really nice. Plus, it charges the fastest of the three. So Conch is pretty solid. However, the most used banner, and probably the most powerful, is the Battalions Backup. So the passive of an extra 20 HP is nice insofar as I suppose it helps you build a charge, and just extra HP is nice. But where it really shines is with the activated ability, which gives you and your team immunity to crits, which is generally not a big deal in sixes. It does mean that you don't really have to pop Uber against a sniper, because the sniper cannot kill your medic with a full charge headshot or body shot. But it also gives a huge damage reduction. How much is it as well? It's either 40 or 60% or something. 35%. Okay, so huge damage, incoming damage resistance. and an extra one on top of that for sentries, which is usually not that relevant. But it can kind of be described as like a mini Uber of sorts. And honestly, the way the damage works out, it almost feels like it is a base damage reduction that, you know, fall off then gets applied to or something. I'm sure that, you know, people who actually test stuff and whatnot can verify how the actual math works there, because it's a huge, it feels more than 35%, right? Like a splash rocket at mid-range can often do, you know, 40-ish damage, which if you would apply that 35% would end up being like 30 something, but in some cases it's like 20. Even in some cases you see like in the teens amount of damage. Just huge reduction. It is a mini Uber, and with all other things being equal, a team with the Battalion's Backup buff wins a fight almost every time. As long as the soldier popping it doesn't just immediately feed and ruin the charge, yeah, it's difficult to win a fight with that huge advantage. So, with that in mind, what are the downsides? Why aren't these really powerful tools seen all the time? And I do talk about, you know, when I have a video about the situational side grades, because a lot of weapons in the game, you can justify running them in certain situations, in certain niches, especially if those are situations or niches in which it's convenient to switch off of an item, such as, like, you know, if you're sacking as a soldier or something, you just get to respawn on the next weapon. But a lot of people just kind of forget to, so there's definitely some element of that. People not really thinking about switching weapons very often. But the big deal, of course, is that they aren't the gunboats. And the gunboats, no matter what, you can guarantee will give you a huge amount of value. Because again, as a soldier, mobility is everything. Mobility is your main tool for attacking people. It's very useful for defending and like rotating spam on doors, as well as like you can fade bomb as a defensive and offensive measure. And also, mobility is just generally useful for traversing the map, and yeah, it's your primary way of surviving, attacking, defending, just doing everything as a soldier. So taking all that extra damage really reduces your mobility. And as a result, unless it's a generally slow game state in which you're not going to be jumping around a lot, then gunboats tend to provide more consistent value. And another thing I should talk about is that the banners kind of have an anti-synergy with soldier as a class. If the banners were, of course, in casual, people talk about how heavy should have the banners, which is an interesting prospect. But if, for example, demo had the banners, they might all be banned, honestly, because demo as a class is not only really good at dealing damage and would be really good at charging those banners, but importantly, demo is a class that likes living, whereas soldier, you know, your life is still very important because, again, you are just a very useful asset for your team, both offensively and defensively. But, you know, if you can afford to lose someone, you'd prefer that person to be one of your soldiers or your scouts. Which, yeah, like they are just inherently less valuable to have around than a demo or a medic, or at least less valuable to have alive. So that presents some kind of anti-synergy with the banners, because you have to stay alive for a long time to build them, generally. So there is that element, of course, present. But where do banners get really useful? Well, when the game slows down and when you know you're not going to be jumping around a lot, banners can be really nice. So I've already talked about pushing last on the second channel and the ways that teams generally, you know, can approach that and get more just dynamic with it and more aggressive with it and be willing to sack more players or different like last hold busting things. And I do talk about the Battalion's Backup because that's the primary use case that it has, is in breaking a last hold. Because it has a very flowcharty way of doing so. You can either try and build the charge into last, which I wouldn't necessarily recommend because It's very difficult to get spam into last, but you can just sack as normal, just double sack as normal, and then farm damage on the counter sack. And that's a somewhat reliable way to build the banner. And as a result, you know, the other team, they can identify that you're running it and then equip it themselves, which honestly they should, otherwise they're likely to just lose the round. But the only way that you aren't building damage during that is if they're just not counter-sacking, which honestly is great, because that means that you basically have 0 chance of getting forced, and the other team has some chance of getting forced. And long term, that benefits you. And of course, you could sack more players to really encourage them to try and counter-sack or push out, in which case your banner soldier can get more damage and charge the banner and whatnot, and it's fine to give up the point because it's going to be a stalemate on the next point, assuming no one uses and the banner's still useful. So yeah, you can see how these can be played around pretty reliably. However, once you get that charge, then it's very straightforward. You exchange into last, and all you're looking to do is get the other team to use Uber. If you can take out a gun during this, that's quite nice. Just normal things you're looking for in a last exchange. But now that they don't have an Uber charge and they're vulnerable to a push, then you pop your banner, re-push with your mini Uber, and then you win the fight. So it's a pretty flowcharty way to just win a last push with a Battalion's Backup. So it's really, really powerful as a result, and is banned in Europe as a result. I don't know if the other banners are. Now, of course, Conch, you can make the case for being, you know, kind of considerably powerful in the sense that, you know, you can just do a bunch of damage to heal off the damage you're taking. But Buff Banner is much worse, honestly. In the same way, it's kind of a microcosm of the crits Uber dichotomy. Because, you know, if you want to push a point, Uber is way, way, way better than crits. Because just mitigating damage is often way more useful than dealing more damage. Because you're often, like, usually the damage trade for pushing a point is in the defender's favor. So getting through doors, it's really nice to be able to mitigate damage rather than deal more. So yeah, as a result, in general, Buff Banner tends to be the weakest of the three. But yeah, they definitely provide some value in that regard. And you definitely see banners run outside of just a last stalemate, but it's hard to get value with them. I know of some soldiers that are just like big banner enjoyers. In particular, when used outside of last, soldiers tend to prefer Conch, actually, because it does have a pretty decent passive benefit, and it's pretty quick to charge, so you're more likely to get a Conch. But it's not uncommon, like if points are actually changing hands and whatnot, that the soldiers never gets a charge, because, again, soldiers tend to die more than other classes, and it does take a fair amount of damage to build that charge. Plus, you know, the problems of you being way less mobile throughout. You are just a gimped version of a gunboat soldier until you get that banner. So yeah, you're really only better off when you actually get the banner. It takes a while to get it, etc., etc. But in some situations, you can make the case. I mean, on Bagel, there's definitely some theory crafting about soldiers running Conch if they're playing Left House, because they're kind of just spotting Left House. Now, of course, on Bagel, you know, still soldiers really value the gunboats because you still want to be mobile and you still have a lot of playmaking potential, even if you are kind of the Left House babysitter. But there's definitely a case to be made for Conch. I mean, with a Conch, you can just win a team fight and get the point. And that's a valuable advantage to have, especially on Bagel, where soldiers get damage so readily and so easily. So yeah, there's definitely some experimentation to be had with the backpacks. I don't know if they're all banned in Europe. I know Battalions absolutely is. Because again, Europe tends to abuse these unlocks more than North America. And if Battalions became just standard meta, I'm sure a lot of people would complain about it in North America. But that being said, it's not that hard to just build your own banner if you're on last, I suppose, once you identify. And a lot of players as well just default switch to a banner on last, because defending last, you're generally less you're less likely to be jumping around and whatnot. The extra health is quite nice for holding a door as well. But with that banner, not only do you have the insurance against the other team potentially having a banner, but it might just be able to help your team push out if you have a couple picks and things might be a little sketchy. It's just a nice little insurance play. So, yeah, banners are interesting, really powerful, all things considered, but they do have some glaring weaknesses, preventing them from just being run full-time most of the time. But overall, I'd say something that's generally unexplored, in particular for like the last break potential. Like Battalions is extremely slept on in North America, and that thing is busted, and should be like a lot of teams' go-tos, because again, you can just sack as normal while you have it on. Like there is nothing stopping you from sacking and pressuring and doing all the normal things that you normally do. You just have to make sure that your pocket soldier, or whichever soldier is running the banner, isn't the one sacking and isn't the one dying, and you know, you just have this nice ticking timer for which you can kind of just win the round if the other team isn't running one. So yeah, banners, really interesting, and there's a lot to consider with them. But yeah, they all kind of have their own thing. Buff banner is worse. And you know what, dude? When they added the passives, I always thought the buff banner still deserved a passive. And for a while, I'm like, okay, what would help the offensive capabilities? I think what would make the buff banner way stronger in like a casual setting is if it had like a passive reload speed buff. That would be like really useful for a soldier to have and kind of synergize with all the whatever. I don't care about the random theory crafting. This game's never gonna get balanced again. So yeah, hope you guys enjoyed, and I will see you next time.